Good morning, everybody.
Good
Morning.
morning.
Good morning. Let's investigate the Dharma together. I think at the heart of our practice is enjoying what in the Soto Zen tradition we call samadhi. There's a concept for this, Jijuyu Zammai, and we recite Dogen's words about that in Jijuyu Zammai, self-fulfilling samadhi. So there's something about that. What does that mean? And I think it's connected with what I want to share today about um, this ancient story going back to the Buddha's time. Anoja seeks the self. What does it mean to seek the self? Because we seek a lot of things. We seek a lot of things in life, and we're constantly looking, we're grasping for something to give us lasting satisfaction. And you might take a moment to think about all the things that you seek for that give you some temporary satisfaction, but but it doesn't quite touch at what the Buddha's teaching is about. There's something that the Buddha teaches that gives us everlasting fulfillment. And in the Soto tradition, we call that self-fulfilling samadhi. And one of the ways that we can access it is through our zazen, through the seated form of meditation. It's by no means the only way, but it's a very prominent way. And the way that it's described in this koan case is seeking self-nature. And that may not sound very interesting to a lot of people these days, because there's a lot of things that we can seek that give us tremendous pleasure. Only it's short-term, it's short-lived. I mean, certainly you can find pleasure in substances, but it's short-lived. You can find pleasure in visual stimulation that we get from our phones, from our screens. We get that visual stimulation. We get enjoyment from what comes in through the ears, through music and other sounds. That certainly gives us some form of pleasure. And there's nothing, inherently unethical about seeking for fulfillment outside the self. There's nothing inherently unethical. However, there is something that is, maybe one way to think about this is it's a much more efficient approach to finding fulfillment, because you don't have to seek it outside the self. You don't have to seek something outside of yourself. In fact, when you're sitting properly in upright zazen, then that fulfillment comes to you, that self-fulfillment. What you're seeking is yourself. And we experience that when we're sitting properly in zazen. We experience the wonder of zazen. It doesn't make sense if you haven't had the experience, or you're not convinced that there is such an experience to be had. It doesn't make sense if you don't have a resolute confidence in waking up. But when we have the taste of it through practice, through sitting, when we have a feeling for it, when we raise up our faith and trust in the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the inevitability of our enlightenment, wow, that changes our practice. But it's hard to see that because it's often obscured by the many multitudes of distractions that come to us through the sense gates, but also comes through us in other ways as well, through our job, through our responsibilities for our job, through our family. All of these things can distract us from self-fulfillment, self-fulfilling samadhi. Even practicing of the Dharma, we can practice the Dharma incorrectly and think we're doing it, but it's actually not enjoyable. So if our practice isn't enjoyable in some way, in some form, if we don't enjoy the practice, then it's not going to last either. So we have to find something that's beyond the mere forms of practice, but the forms they are designed to help us to enter into Jijiyu Zamai, self-fulfilling samadhi, all of the forms. And the basic one that we start with is Zazen, sitting on the floor with legs crossed in a lotus posture, with back upright, mind calmed and settled. There's something to that posture. So I want to share this story. Anoja seeks the self. This dates back to the time of the Buddha in India. Anoja was a great queen, and this is found in this book I'm reading from, the book Hidden Lamp. And by the way, we're studying this on Thursday evenings with Zen Field, so please join us at 6:30 to 7:30 on Thursday evenings. We'll do a short guided meditation followed by reading and discussion of one of the stories. These are stories from 25 centuries of awakened women. So it hones in on women's experience, and I find it a helpful counterbalance because Zen, a lot of the stories we draw from are heavily male oriented. So, and my teacher, of course, was female, Diane Roshi, and I've found that there's a nice counterbalance, especially in the religious world and the spiritual world, to have female leaders. It helps to balance our mind in a very positive way. I'm not against male leaders, of course, I'm a male, and there are many good male teachers, but it's very nice to have that counterbalance. And I think it's not just nice, it's absolutely essential, and it's for our well-being and our survival, really, that we start to give heed to female leaders, female teachers, and there's a lot of good female teachers in the Zen world today. Anoja was a great queen at the time of the Buddha. All right, so I'll just pause there on that one sentence because we need to keep in mind that the Buddha was from the regal stock. He was slated to be a king, a political leader, and he denounces the throne. And here's a story about a queen and a king. It's interesting because the Buddha, in his lifetime, he encounters many people of royalty, both kings and queens, and they all knew he was slated to be a king, and he rejects that particular path, his own path, which was a big deal. I don't think in our modern mindset, it's hard for us to understand the profundity of what the Buddha did in rejecting his duty, his Dharma as a king. You don't easily reject your Dharma. What you are born into, so his caste was the Kshatriya, the warrior caste. He was slated to be a king. That was his Dharma. And in the Indian context, the Dharma means that was his sacred duty. And to not fulfill that meant, in that particular mindset, it meant all kinds of bad karma would occur to him. And certainly he would not be reborn in a good place. He would be reborn and have to resolve that karma. So Buddha throws that whole worldview and that whole mindset into question. And even the word Dharma has a different nuance for the Buddha. The Dharma is not a sacred duty, but it's the truth. So what is, a question we can ask ourselves, what is truth for us? What brings awakening for us? What brings a lasting, transformational awakening to us that is long-term, that is satisfactory, that brings a sense of ease and joy to our hearts, to our minds, as well as to those that we interact with. Because if our relationships are all sour, and yet we feel some degree of happiness, that's not quite enough. We need to also develop that compassion for those who are around us when they're suffering. And I'm not expert at this, but I know that's the direction I choose and I wish to, and I vow to point my life in, is how can I develop greater compassion? Again, I'm not an expert at it, but it's the direction I wish to go in. And so I feel like we as a Sangha also need to move in that, continue to walk in that direction, into a direction that includes our relationships as part of our spiritual awakening. So here, Anoja was a great queen at the time of the Buddha. Her husband, King Mahakapina, journeyed to hear the Buddha's teaching and became a monk, along with many of his attendants. Well, how do you like that? That must have been some meeting. These stories, they don't give us a lot of information, and we gotta fill in the gaps with what's missing here. It doesn't say much more than he sent a messenger back to his court with the news, and when Anoja asked if the king had sent a message for her personally, the messenger said, "He gives all his royal power to you. Enjoy the glory and pleasure." That's all we know. Like, whoa, what happened here? Here's king and queen, they're married, and all of a sudden the king encounters the Buddha, gives up, just like the Buddha. We don't know very much about this king in the Buddhist lore. We don't hear very much about King Mahakapina and his teaching, but it must have been a profound thing. I mean, equally profound to the Buddha's own decision, like Siddhartha as a young man desiring to cut his hair and remove his kingly attire and take on the garb of a homeless monk, right? And here's another king at the same time the Buddha doing the same thing. I wonder what was his Dharma. What did he teach? And then he sends word back to his wife saying, enjoy the kingdom and all of the pleasures, they're free. So what was their relationship like? When we read a story like this, we have to keep in mind that it's being filtered through a modern cultural lens. We're viewing this story through the 21st century. We're viewing this story through the lens of American culture, which says that your partner in marriage is somebody that you've chosen and somebody that you desire. That's not the case in 6th century BCE in India, where marriages were arranged and your job was dictated to you even before you even came to maturity, right? Like the Buddha, he was slated to be a king, not a monk. And he everyone had prearranged, he didn't have any say. I mean, maybe he had some say in the marriage, and some choice there. But most people in a marriage in that time, they didn't choose who they were to be with. It was all prearranged. And that's not just in ancient India. That's to my mind, my understanding, it's in pretty much every culture. And this idea of romance and passion for your spouse is very much a modern idea within the past 100 years or so. But still, you can find lots of vestiges of it around the world today, of arranged marriages. So when we look at the story and the actions of the king towards his wife, we have to remember that a whole different mindset gives rise to this kind of thinking that could, allow for a king to say to his wife, enjoy the kingdom, enjoy the pleasures, see you later, right? At least that's what it seems like here. But instead, the story continues. Anoja says, the Buddha could not have arisen only for the benefit of men, but for women as well. Isn't that an interesting statement? the Buddha, that it's an interesting insight. I mean, she seems to have already at the start their curiosity for what her husband has done. Not She doesn't seem to be proceeding with anger or outrage like we would maybe expect in our modern times, or maybe with disdain or quiet resentment, or maybe even not caring at all. Right? She proceeds with a sense of curiosity. What happened? And so again, remembering the cultural context of this, where Indian culture takes seriously awakening, enlightenment. This was not just the Buddha that was interested in enlightenment, but many, many people. The whole culture was revolving around the desire for waking up. And that's hard for us in our culture to get our minds wrapped around, because we live in a culture that revolves around pleasure, short-term happiness. We revolve around that. And so it's very hard for us to get our minds wrapped around something as profound as a kind of eternal happiness. Not a happiness that we get after we die, but being able to receive jijuyu, self-fulfilling samadhi, to be able to receive the enjoyment of the Dharma, of the Buddha's teaching, and of each other, the Sangha, to be nourished by that, and to find contentment here and now. Right? So Queen Queen Anoja is curious. She's like, this whole awakening thing, it seems to be the purview of men, but it can't be just for men. That's an interesting insight right there. This is not just a male. So she has an insight, and she's breaking down the walls of culture and prejudice of that time, which is a significant insight, and it provides an opening, a doorway for her to also avail herself of the Buddha's teaching. And what is it that somehow there's something more important than the power, the prestige, the pleasure of being a queen. There's something more important than that. The scales are tipped the other direction, and that really requires us to pause and reflect deeply, because I think in our culture, all of us we see ourselves as king or queen, and if we were in the position of a political leader, we can see ourselves making different decisions than they do, right? But here's a culture that has as its focus the attainment of awakening as even higher than the power that comes from being in a political role. I think that's very significant here, and it gives a counterbalance to how we often think of where power and pleasure and fulfillment comes from. That power and pleasure, fulfillment comes from recognition, from being able to say something and everybody does what you want them to do. That's not so with the Buddha's teaching, power isn't dependent on you being able to say something and everybody does what you say, right? That's often how we think of it, though. Is like, if I had power, people would listen to me and do what I say. Not the case. Not the case for the Dharma. The true Dharma is not found by wielding that kind of power. It comes from self-fulfilling samadhi through zazen and through activities that we do that are centered on the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching. So she and her attendants also made the journey to hear the Buddha and to ordain. Whoa. Mahakapina, now a monk, that was the king, Mahakapina, was present. Okay, so the queen, Anoja, she's present he's present when the queen arrives. When the queen and her attendant, let's see. But the Buddha, using his magic powers, made the king invisible. So she doesn't know he's there. She has no idea where he is, apparently. The Buddha uses his magic power to make the king invisible. Okay, if I've lost you here at magic power, some of us coming from a staunchly secular, more atheistic bent will hear that and be immediately turned off by the idea that the Buddha uses magic to make somebody invisible. But we know that magic is real in many ways. By that I mean, I was watching this show on Netflix about a magician, and they conjure up these ways of making illusions, and so that's not actually uncommon. And certainly if you watch a video, there's loads. It's filled with illusions. We know people can't fly, but yet if we watched a video, we see Superman flying. There's myriads of illusions that take place that our mind can be tricked by. And let's just think of it in that light, that the Buddha is using trickery to hide the king in some way, but he's present nonetheless. When the queen and her attendants heard the Buddha speak, they all became stream enterers. Right? They tasted awakening. They had their thirst quenched with the Buddha's teaching. The stream enterer is the first of 4 levels of Buddhist realization. Then the Buddha asked Anoja, would you rather seek the king or seek the nature of the self? So she's being tested here. The Buddha's testing. Would you rather seek your husband, the king, now that you're here? Okay? She doesn't know he's there. Would you rather seek him or seek the nature of the self? Again, this can only be appetizing to that question of seeking the nature of the self versus seeking the king. We don't know what that means to her, right? But we could have some idea of it, even looking through the lens of 21st century, looking through the American cultural lens. There's some attachment there, right, between a husband and a wife, and for the husband to just leave, we can imagine the disarray, the disorder, not only of a family, but of a whole kingdom. And the desire to restore that on some level must have been there for Queen Anoja. All right, so the Buddha asked this question, would you rather seek the king or the nature of the self? That's a very interesting question. Without hesitation, she replied, the nature of the self. Whew, that ends the story. But it calls up curiosity, and if we can enter into this story, right, what's going on in that queen's mind that she would choose to prefer the nature of the self over her husband, the king. And so I want to just share a modern story. And maybe some of you will resonate with this, but my teacher, Diane Roshi, this idea, of having to make a choice between your spouse and the Dharma. This koan raises this question up. This is like you have to make a choice between your spouse on the one hand and the Dharma on the other hand. And I think a lot of people, this is an interesting place to think about and to question and become curious about. Do you have to make a choice between your family and the Dharma? Do you have to make a choice between your family and the Dharma? That seems like a really hard choice to make. And so it's just something to think about. In the case of my teacher, she shared a story of being married to a man that she, well after they divorced, she came around and they, to the last of my knowledge, they were good friends. But in the process, she didn't want to initially marry him, in part because she loved to dance. She was a classical ballet dancer and she loved to dance. And she was giving that up by entering into the marriage. And yet the marriage took her around the world on business trips because he was very wealthy, and to look for places to sell his product. And that's one of the ways she got to Japan initially, and she made friends there because her husband said that if you wanted more money than the money that I allow you, then, and this is in the 1960s, she had an allowance that was given. If you want more money than that, then you have to get a job. And so she started working as an English teacher in Japan. And but they didn't stay there for that long. They went to other countries as well, and then eventually came back to the United States and settled in New Jersey and Princeton area. She was not satisfied because for a number of years she was with him. She had to put on parties for wealthy businessmen who smoked big stogies, and she was asthmatic, so the smoke bothered her lungs and she'd have to clean it all the time. And the men seemed to be generally interested more in how they can make money, and her job was basically to serve them. She grew very weary of the marriage, and around 6 years, she requested a divorce from her husband. In those days, you had to legally, the husband had to agree to a divorce, and he didn't agree to it. He said, she wondered, why we're not having children. We're just, I don't feel like I have a place in this relationship. I want a divorce. And he said, well, wait, I do want to have kids. It's just not the right time yet. But she couldn't wait. And she was finding herself suicidal. Right? She said, I was driving on the wrong side of the road, on back roads in rural parts of New Jersey. She was finding herself going crazy. She was seeing a therapist that prescribed something like Valium, that, being a very physical person, very active, a dancer, a classical ballet dancer, she didn't like how she felt taking these psychiatric drugs. She knew she wasn't right. She was separating out from her body. She was going crazy. And she said my third option was escape. And so one day, when her husband was out, she bought herself a one-way ticket to Japan because she knew her husband wouldn't know where to find her or where she went. And she took the things that she needed, flew to Japan, and that's where she lived for the next 23 years. And 15 of those years, the last 15 of those years, were in monasteries and temples with really deep practice there. So that was her, and she, prior to entering in the monastery, she attempted to have a relationship with a Japanese man, thinking that perhaps marriage is in the cards for me. And unfortunately, that's another story, but that relationship fell apart. And so here she was in her late 30s, early 40s, without having any, not able to find the kind of love or marriage that we would think of in the modern times, and seeking something. And, a failed marriage, failed relationship. I think a lot of people find themselves in those categories. So this story of Anoja may speak to a great number of people. Like, what's more important, the king, or the Buddha asked, what do you seek more, the king or the nature of the self? this may speak to a lot of people, but I want to pause here. This is kind of part one here, and ask you guys, what do you think? What is inspiring about this particular story for you, and what do you find problematic about this story? All right. So this is part one of this, and what I'd like us to do is, if you're in the room at Nebraska Zen Center, maybe break off into groups of 2 or 3 and think about this question. What do you find personally inspiring about this story of Anoja and King Mahakapina? What do you find potentially problematic about this story for us in modern times in American culture?